So good afternoon to all of you. Welcome to what turns out to be the last event in the Humanities Festival, except for the movie that some of us will go for later. So this is the last talking event, debate event in the Humanities Festival. And as it turns out, it is also the very last event taking place in the Wien Museum before the reconstruction that, as I heard, will just start tomorrow. So this is the very last view you can get of the Wien Museum. Get your impression and save it to your memory cards, the memory card in the brain or on your telephone. I think it will be closed for like 3 years, and then we will see what comes afterwards. My name is Ludger Hagedorn. I am a permanent fellow to the Institute for Human Sciences, IWM, here in Vienna, one of the co-organizers of the Humanities Festival. And I'm very happy to welcome my colleague Pavel Barša for this talk. Pavel is one of the Czech Republic's foremost political scientists, an independent and imaginative mind, an attentive observer, and as I may say, and this is really what I mean, a political thinker. This is what characterizes you most. He's working as a professor of political science at Charles University, and he also was a long-time researcher at IIR, Institute of International Relations, that is a sub-department of the Czech Foreign Ministry. I will very briefly mention to you 3 of his publications, not to give you a record of it, but to just give you an impression of what Pavel is doing. First, a book from 2015, Ways to Emancipation, where he characterizes 3 different ways of emancipation: existential revolt, political revolution, and civil action. I think this very briefly gives you an idea of what the book is about. Then Memory and Genocide from 2011, Reflections on Holocaust Policy. And finally, Pavel is also working a lot on topics of immigration and integration. I will mention a book from 2005, co-authored with Andrea Baršová, Immigration and the Liberal State, Immigration and Integration Policies in the USA, in Western Europe, and in the Czech Republic. One of his main and long-term interests is his research on the rise of populism, generally, but especially in the Central European region, and also his concerns about xenophobic tendency that he does not hesitate to articulate and to repel. And finally, not to forget, Pavel is also the bass player of what used to be a Czech underground band. I didn't have the chance to ask you before, is it really, would you translate it as the Courageous Beavers?
Yeah.
The Courageous Beavers. So he's the bass player of the famous Courageous Beavers.
This is probably untranslatable. Only people from who have some background in the Czech culture can know the allusion of that. Otherwise, it's...
Yeah, I spare any parallels to the world of politics where you see the trees falling down and now don't know who was behind. So this is the Courageous Beavers. So welcome, Pavel, for this talk. Welcome to the Humanities Festival. The title of our debate today is Understanding the Illiberal Turn in Central Europe. You see, Pavel, we have a lot of work ahead of us. Understanding the illiberal turn, this is quite a challenge. So the main question, how can it be that Central Europe, the region that once birthed the anti-communist liberal utopia of the 1970s and 1980s, has turned illiberal, anti-immigrant and nationalistic today? We all noticed the discussions about this in recent years over the hesitation, let's call it cautiously, the hesitation of Central European countries to accept refugees. That was one of the outstanding issues. But in general, I mean, there's big concern about political developments in Poland, Hungary, Czech Republic, just to mention a few countries, and a certain break with liberal traditions and liberal order in terms of press freedom, jurisdiction, procedural law, questions of constitution, academic freedom, and not least also dubious financial transactions and corruption. So how to explain these phenomena? How to explain the growth of corruption, of xenophobia, and of political populism? I just saw there is a nice picture behind us in the Wien Museum, so once we're here for the very last time, we could have a look at this. For a very long time it seemed that liberalism is just this little beautiful fish in the mouth of this big monster, but the interesting thing that Pavel is holding is that his understanding of the recent development is to ask whether liberalism itself does not have some tendencies that also led to the development as we see them today. It is important to note that Pavel Barša is someone who was closely involved in several Czech civil society movements which challenged and helped to overthrow the communist regime. So that means his investigation of the post-communist tradition in Central and Eastern Europe and his provocative, indeed it is provocative, challenging of the liberal ideology is also a criticism from within his own thought and his own biography. We will do the format as before. We will have the debate here for like 35 minutes, and afterwards, and this is what I promise, we leave enough space for all comments and questions by the audience. So, Pavel, let's start right away with the first question, maybe a bit of a surprising start. I would want to ask you, we are all used to criticizing the populist governments, but I know that you have a very differentiated view. What is positive about populism in Eastern Europe? Just to think about maybe the role of the state, something that I think plays an important role for your thinking as well. And also, I think you're one of those who definitely says populism is not per se anti-democratic, quite the opposite. So what is positive about the current populist wave?
I don't know if I would phrase it in this way. I'm not able to say really, to embrace populism in that way, to really endorse the thesis that there is something positive in populism. Mm-hmm. But it's true that I tried to, as anybody else from my background, we were quite in shock 4 years ago, 2015, during the refugee crisis, when we saw basically all established political elites in Central Europe, by which I mean I will narrow the concept of Central Europe. So when I say Central Europe, I will talk about Visegrad countries, okay? The political elites all actually were quite inimical towards any cooperative posture vis-à-vis refugees. In the Czech Republic, it was I would say it was even worse because we had this government in which Social Democrats participated, and they too accepted this mantra that this is some sort of migration flow which has to be regulated and avoided actually to name, even to use the word refugee, right? So it was quite bad. But very early on, I realized. So at first, I thought, as anybody else, that populists are the first enemies. And of course, then what happened after if you remember, after the summer of 2015 in Poland, this Law and Justice Party came to government in the fall. Of course, we knew that Law and Justice Party and Viktor Orban, who was already in power at that time, they would capitalize on the refugee flow, and they did that. But very early on, I realized that it's not only the populists who might be dangerous to liberal democracy, it's also liberals, because some of the liberal reactions which we experienced were quite striking. And for instance, after the Brexit referendum, which was 1 year after, almost 1 year after this refugee crisis, I remember one of the liberal public intellectuals in the Czech Republic who took quite courageous pro-refugee stance preceding summer. Tomáš Halík. He's a liberal Catholic, quite known. Basically one of the bearers of Václav Havel heritage or legacy in the Czech Republic. And he commented on the Brexit in a way which was understandable, but for me politically unacceptable. He simply said, well, maybe the Brexit shows that the uneducated people shouldn't be allowed to decide, to have a voice about such important issues, right? And I think, and this kind of discourse, of course, developed further. So you have the whole kind of statesmen from those people, especially in the Czech Republic, of course. We have, this is similarity with Poland and Hungary, that we have the president who is one of the frontmen of this wave, of this populist wave, and he's really trying to appeal to less educated people, to people with poorer resources than normal Czech middle class, but he also is able to resonate with the middle class. But it's true that the question of educated elite, gifted with other resources as well, economic, culture, political, and uneducated people, to which Zeman is, he's trying to resonate with them, is a very big issue. And to simply say that those people, because they vote for Zeman or because they vote for the Brexit, shouldn't be allowed to participate into the decision-making process is simply undemocratic. It's as much dangerous to the idols of liberal democracy and institutions of liberal democracy that it has to be named as such. So we have populist xenophobia, against which we have liberal demophobia, let's call it, people who simply, members of the elite, who simply think that they should decide the most important things.
That was already, I think, a very nice introduction to your critique of liberalism that we can continue later on. I would try to start again from a little bit different angle again and bring the two things later on together. The angle that I would want to start has very much to do with your biography. I mentioned in the beginning that you were also involved in dissidence movements, but today the dissident heritage is also in the center of your critique, I would say. The good thing about it is you do this kind of criticism very seriously, and to do a serious criticism is really also an appreciation of something. So in that sense, I think you still very highly regard the dissident time and the dissident movement, but you also dare to criticize it. If we look at the development of today, and if we ask this question, so what has gone in Central Europe? Obviously, I think this is what we can presuppose. Maybe some things have gone wrong if we see the current political development. So what has gone wrong? And you, in one of your earlier articles, you very nicely outlined that there is like two main answers to that. The first answer would say, well, this is the heritage of communism. We are in the post-communist times. We try to overcome it, but it will just take some more time. We had it before in the talk by Ivan Vejvoda, who said it might take some 60 years, even more than Václav Havel said. Václav Havel famously said in the 20th anniversary of the '89 revolution, so 10 years ago, he said we will need at least one generation to overcome this heritage, and then finally we will arrive in the promised lands of liberalism and of liberal democracy, and this is only like difficulties on the way. So the train is going, it has come to a certain halt in the post-communist desert, but the promised lands are still on the horizon. The second explanation, this is your explanation, would hold, well, there is no more promised lands to be expected. Where should this train go? And you very nicely, in one of your characterizations, you say very nicely, so even if the train would ever continue and we would go on to the promised lands, who would await us there in the promised lands? Donald Trump, Marine Le Pen? Is that the kind of promised lands that we are going for? So the intention is very clear. Also, the Western political setup in the meantime has changed drastically, and this narration of we will go there at some time, it just needs a little moment. This narration has become fragile or doubtful. Would you want to, could you relate to that and tell us why you are so definitely tending for the second option, that this narration is over? And I mean, I just add, but this is a personal note. I mean, you're very, very critical of Václav Havel, especially. Once again, I would say this is also a kind of appreciating him. But you say this very nice, or not very nice things about him, that from like a prophet he turned into a priest, into a pope that anointed all the new people coming to the White House. We remember all these famous stories with Bill Clinton and so on. So he was like the pope that anointed them into their new jobs. And his charisma he lent to everybody and everything, except for Barack Obama, you say, because him he didn't like so much, because he didn't have the same imperial tendencies as all the other presidents.
He identified the new era, and of which he was a prophet, with American hegemony. I think it's wrong. I mean, it was linked, of course, with American hegemony, and maybe some of us are now even nostalgic of this American hegemony facing the Chinese hegemony, maybe in 30 years or so. But I will come back to, I think, to the core of your question. It's not really personal attack on Havel. I mean, Havel was really one of the most important persons in the 70s and 80s, for me personally and for many other people. Actually, I should have made some correction. I was not a dissident until '88, basically. I was playing bass guitar in an underground band, but our independent band, we actually played publicly, so we were not really underground. But then the organization, NGO, which was organizing the concerts of the groups like we, was imprisoned in '85, and from that point on, we have moved actually to closer and closer to the dissident movement. But in any case, I was involved in what we could call the civil society of the time, you know, associations which were somehow found the public or official space, sometimes were completely unofficial. This kind of free association, civil society, which Havel was actually preaching about, was my experience, and I was very receptive to his discourse, especially to the power of the powerless. So it's not really personal. I think it maybe, you know, what you mentioned, that he turned from a prophet, he turned to the priest. Maybe we could find many other examples of those rebels who, once they are victorious, they are not really able to continue to be critical and to play their critical role, which is what happened to him. But I think the core question is that in the face of populism, there were two liberal reactions, I think, and they were linked with different attitudes to the legacy of 1989. The first, and both of them had different operated within a different time consciousness. You mentioned this, what you mentioned about Havel is basically Moses posture, right, from the Hebrew Bible, that you have to have two generations in order to be able to reach the promised land, right? Because and that Havel was completely literal. He said that literally. That basically 10 years ago he said well, you know, even the people who are in their 20s now, they were raised in the families which were shaped by the communist reality of the 70s and 80s. So we have to wait yet another generation, right? And I think this is the time consciousness, not in the Hebrew Bible, I don't think so, it's a different story, but how it was used within this liberal discourse, a linear consciousness, linear consciousness of time, which can imagine the movement either forward to the shining future, or backward to the dark totalitarian past. Nothing else, basically. You either move forward or move backward. That's one thing. Another thing with the different, the attitude to the legacy of 1989 of this liberal response was basically uncritical, unreserved embrace of that legacy, saying we were always right. Now what happened is that our enemies somehow they have grown stronger, and we have still defend our legacy. We have still defend our original project. Okay, that was it. So you basically deny any internal contradictions, for instance, of the post-1989 era, either in your country or globally. You say this is not a problem. The problem is, for instance, Putin. You know, externalize the threat to say, well, it's either Putin or some relics of the past. You know, so the liberals of this thought, which I would call it anti-totalitarian liberalism, right? In the Czech Republic, they would say that Zeman is the relics of the communist past, right? And the agent of Putin. Right? They have constantly, my colleagues who organized the demonstrations against Zeman and Babiš lately, they would call them casually comrades. You know, what about our comrades? Right? So they are still fighting the same enemy. They are still fighting totalitarian enemy. Okay? I don't think it's a very productive and fruitful position, because you missed one era, basically. You are still fighting the dystopic consequences of the communist utopia, right? While you are actually coping with the dystopic consequences of post-communist utopia, your liberal utopia. Which brings me to the second kind of liberalism, which I would call critical liberalism, or even self-critical liberalism, that you look at the legacy of '89 not as a monolithic, first of all, not as a monolithic legacy, but rather as something which was quite composite from the very beginning. You had liberal elements, there were liberal elements there, but we shouldn't be surprised, for instance, by nationalism in Poland, because we all know that '89 was also an expression of craving for national sovereignty in this region, right? In all those countries. I mean, nationalism was part of the package. Anti-imperialist nationalism, I should have said, okay? We were all happy to finally be able to liberate ourselves from this evil empire in the East, okay? So, of course, the nationalist element was subordinated and embedded in the broader liberal agenda. Because at that time, not forget about that, it was the global liberal moment in the whole world. It was not only Central Europe, and what we, Central European intellectuals, were actually, the discourse we were using were the discourse actually which was worldwide discourse of liberalism, anti-totalitarian liberalism. And that discourse developed in the 70s and 80s. After basically one of the landmark could be 68. That the utopias, the communist utopia, but not only communist utopia, also the utopias of national liberation in the third world, all those utopias which were linked with the strong idea of collective will, which will overthrow some sort of tyranny, either economic or Western tyranny in the case of the non-European countries, would take the state, and the state then will reorganize completely society. Those kind of collectivist utopia, let's call them, where you have the political force which capture the state and in the name of a nation, liberated nation or class, will launch a radical transformation. They ended up, and that was our discourse, I actually shared the discourse, those kind of utopias ended up in Gulag and in Auschwitz, basically. They ended up with the mass graves. So instead of those utopias, what we actually embraced was the Last Utopia. Samuel Moyn, American historian, calls it Last Utopia, which is the
utopia of human rights, yeah.
Of human rights, humanitarianism, liberal democracy, which is different, which is where you actually don't believe that the state would help you to reorganize society, but your main concern is how to defend individuals against the state, right? After all those experiences of the 20th century, how to defend us, individuals, against the state. So that was our utopia, and we didn't, some of us did realize, but couldn't help to be in that corner. I actually had quite leftist background, so I realized that this kind of political liberalism has a brother, right? Economic liberalism. And I didn't share economic liberalism. But still, there was a collusion, ideological collusion, because both of those ideologies were anti-statist. So we launched our anti-communist transformation, while at the same time in the West, in the name of this liberal ideology, the welfare states were dismantled. Okay, so that's, for instance, one element which we should look at critically in retrospect and say, okay, so were we not actually complicit with the wave of, with the last 40 years of globalization and its consequences, for instance, huge social inequalities? The first kind of liberals don't really ask those questions. They are not interested in them. They still think that their utopia of the turn of the 80s and 90s is still a valid project.
Pavel, may I just ask in between? We continue the same line. Your critique of liberalism, this is what you already laid out very nicely, very much so is a critique of the elites, cultural elites and economic elites, both of them. So I think you agree that there is a clash between the elites and the so-called common people. This is not an invention of the populists. There is something like that, and we have to do something about it, right? What is the way out? Generally, these two strata of society tend to clash because the cultural elite, the economic elite, has resources that the so-called common people does not have. Economic resources, cultural resources, political resources, network resources, and so on. So because of that, because they are better off, because they have more resources, they tend to praise meritocracy and individualism. So you are in charge of your own luck, go for your own life. You are in charge of making money, of being happy in your life. This is meritocracy, you earn it, you deserve it. While on the other side, we have the so-called common people that, in opposition to this, to meritocracy and individualism, would favor collectivism or a kind of social solidarity. This, I think, is the clash that very much characterizes the societies, what we're discussing now. Do you see a way out? For a long time, I think there was an attempt to bridge both sides. For example, what we had in the West German society after the Second World War, the so-called soziale Marktwirtschaft, I think in some sense tried to do this. Are these times over? Why are they over? And what could it be replaced with?
Okay, I will take a detour but I will try to be short because I think the question is linked with those. I agree with your outline, right? That basically there are two kinds of values, right? Two values. One value which stresses, let's call it individual self-determination, right, or individual emancipation, for which you need not the protective state, but for which you need the state which ensures your individual rights, right? And another kind of value which stresses the opposite, the needs of the collectivity represented by the state to redistribute resources and to care about equality, right? Of course, the first kind of value is preferred by people who are gifted with resources. The second kind of value is very often preferred by people who are not endowed with resources logically. So they actually see in the state not their potential enemy, as the liberals do, but potential protector. The institutions which. So, but I think it's even deeper. The very term liberal democracy is trying the most general idea of liberal democracy is combining those two, because you have liberal side and you have democratic side. On the liberal side, you have precisely those things which Kaczynski and Orban and Zeman are trying to dismantle. Individual human rights, the rule of law, checks and balances, constitutionalism, you know, the liberal procedures which ensure individual rights, but which also ensures that majority, if it wins the elections, is not able to destroy minorities, okay? This is the liberal side, which is, of course, valued more by elites because they don't need the strong state most of the time, because they have resources, they can rely on them. On the other hand, you have and it's part of the same package actually, democracy. Democracy means in many constitutions, many European constitutions are actually using this Rousseauian language, you know, the sovereignty of the people, the will of the people, meaning a people living on a certain territory, which means also that what's meant is a nation, right? A nation. So a nation state, without a nation state, there is no liberal democracy. We don't know any democracy. There were some liberals who were talking about transnational federalism as a way how to avoid sovereignty of the people, which would infringe on the elite's influence and power. So, and I think a political program then can be differentiated according how they balance those two sides, okay? We are of course horrified by the populist attempt to dismantle the liberal side, okay? Because that would meant that instead of liberal democratic state, you would have authoritarian state or majoritarian state, you know. They are able to win elections, Orban's, Kaczynski's and others, you know. So, but they absolutize the will of the majority and try to crush minorities, okay? But the opposite, what we were facing in the 70s and 80s was the opposite one-sidedness, in a way, that the party and the state, in the name of the majority, of course it was completely manipulated in the last decades of communism, but in the rhetoric was like collectivist rhetoric, we justified crushing the rights of minorities, of individuals, and so on and so forth. So the liberal democracy tries to keep both ends in one game, right? Which is why you can say, I think we can say what I said at the very beginning, the liberals can be dangerous as well, because they try to, this was actually Friedrich Hayek before the Second World War, who was musing about European federalism, exactly because he liked the idea that there would be no democracy which would infringe on economic processes. Okay, so, but I don't know if I...
Pavel, can I bring in one more point, because I'm afraid that we are running out of time, and we will keep our promise that we include. Sorry, I can't understand you.
We will come
you will have your word after. Just give us a few more minutes. I wanted to bring in one more aspect, Pavel, that I think is crucial. In the beginning, I mentioned that you have done a lot of research on xenophobia and that this is an important topic for your work. Your attempt to explain the degree of xenophobia in these Central European countries, I think you have a very interesting explanation for that. You say, once again, this also has to do with 89 or with post-89, let's say, post-89, when Central Europe had this idea of a return to Europe, as it was called. This was an idea propagated by very many Central European intellectuals. György Konrad, who just very recently died, to be mentioned maybe in first place. And you interestingly say, and this is what I would want to ask you, so how valid this argument really is, you say it was this idea of a return to Europe that fueled was also influential for the tendencies that we have today. And you would explain it by saying that this idea of a return to Europe meant that before that, this whole territory that once belonged to the Austro-Hungarian Empire was hijacked or kidnapped by some external power, Russian, Asian, whatever, foreign power, was kidnapped for a while and now comes back to Europe. And you immediately parallelize this and say this is like the first step to what later on was called the Euro-Atlantic civilization. And you even say this has a Huntington-like dimension of clash of civilizations. I get the point. Nevertheless, I still have a problem to really immediately go over from this idea of a return to Europe to today's xenophobia. Maybe you can build a bit on that.
I think that also, I mean, if we agree that in the long 70s, as some historians like to call that period, in the long 70s there was actually the fading away of collectivist utopias, and there was a void which was filled on the one hand by human rights and this last utopia I mentioned, anti-statist utopia or humanitarianism. But there was another way how to fill the void, which was basically instead of the future-oriented political project or ideological vision, begin to concentrate on identity, cultural identity, which is inherited from the past. Okay, and that was the function of the discourse of Central Europe, basically in the 70s and 80s. You know, those intellectuals who in the 60s they would still discuss the clash of the systems, like free world versus totalitarianism or something like that. Suddenly they began to discuss not like general projects of society, but we, the Czechs, we used to live in Austro-Hungarian Empire, which is Latin or Christian civilization, and now we are invaded and occupied and controlled by an empire which is Orthodox Christian and Eastern. So there is a civilizational difference, okay? There is a civilizational difference, which is more important than ideological difference, okay? And that was partly what, I mean, I'm a little bit caricaturing the discourses which were more complex than that, but that was the argument. Instead of the clash of ideologies, which are future-oriented, you had clash of civilizational identities. In which sense I'm saying, okay, the discourse of Central Europe was Huntingtonian clash of civilization avant la lettre, exactly, because, you know, Russia was in the East and it was culturally defined, it was not ideologically defined. What happened with Euro-Atlanticism? I mean, as we who remember turn of the 80s and 90s have difficulties to remember also that in that time the term Euro-Atlantic civilization wasn't used. I didn't hear at that time that we used the term the return to Europe, but of course we knew on the other side of the Iron Curtain that the leader of free world or Western world, including Western Europe, is the United States of America. So actually we said the return to Europe, but implicitly what we meant was return to the West, including the United States, okay? That's the first thing, which I think is quite important to remember. So the return, it was, institutionally speaking, it meant to enter both the NATO, both the European Union, or at least to have hope that we enter the European Union and the NATO. Okay? But what happened then, once, for instance, Havel, if you look at his speeches, when he came across the term Euro-Atlantic civilization, he immediately took over the term and began to use the term Euro-Atlantic civilization, okay, at the turn of the 90s and 2000s. And then we had at the same time, Havel himself, he's a good case in point, I think, so I will talk about him. Or at least mentioned, he also was famous for his very universalistic human rights discourse. He combined the two, which are potentially in clash, of course, because either you are talking about the Euro-Atlantic civilization and try to, you know, are speaker of the rights of that civilization to development against other civilizations, or you are talking about human rights which are supposedly universal. But if you looked at Havel's intervention in defense of human rights in his period, or in his last period, he would never defend human rights of people who are on the side, on the other side, or potentially at least, on the other side of the American hegemony. So it was clear that his...
and when and where does xenophobia come into the picture?
Okay,
yeah.
Very simply, the framework, if you take this framework, it functions very well during the refugee crisis, because those were non-Europeans. Why on earth we should care about them? I remember clearly Jean-Claude Juncker in the fall 2015 when he was saying something which I actually completely endorsed. He was saying, look, those Eastern Europeans, they are, you know, we were welcoming them if they were fleeing the Soviet Empire, and now they refuse to take in refugees from the conflict zone, okay? And I completely agree with that. But I also followed the reactions in the Czech media and the Czech in social media, and people didn't understand the point. Because they were saying, but they are not Europeans, they are not Westerners. Why to take them in, okay? They didn't understand the analogy, right? They didn't understand Juncker. They said, oh, he's killing us, or whatever. Because so my point is not actually you made stronger point that I am doing. I'm not blaming the Central Europeanist discourse for this, but I am simply saying that that discourse didn't immunize us against this, because its paradigm is actually Eurocentric, right? So it didn't really immunize us. As a matter of fact, in the Havelist camp, you have two wings. You have xenophobic wings. His closest advisors, actually, at that, some of his closest advisors, like Žantovský, Vondra, are in the xenophobic camp, and it's quite coherent. Then they don't have to change their discourse. Okay, they simply specify. They are saying, okay, we always knew that we are part of the Western civilization. First, we were fighting the Russian Empire, you know, Eastern power, and now we are fighting other Easterners, Muslims, right? So they are quite coherent. But there is also the second wing of Havelist camp, okay? People who are trying to save universality of human rights. So it's not that I would blame this discourse, but I'm simply saying that this discourse did not immunize us against xenophobic wave like this.
So Pavel is not only willing, but I would say eager to discuss with all of you. In fact, he would have wanted to do it earlier on, but now we are also already a bit late. So please, if you have any comments, questions, you have the microphone. Who wants to be first?
Thank you. One very simple question. Would the discourse, the discussions on these topics benefit from what I would call a methodological or conceptual move away from dichotomies, the populist versus, I don't know, the elitist, the nationalist versus the universalist, and so on, and begin to realize that in all these facts, in all these areas, sorry, we're dealing with a continuum. You pointed to that when you said liberalism has to be mixed with a measure of collectivism, or with, I would say, with social justice. Almost any of these topics, I think, would greatly benefit in terms of clarification if we gave up the liberal versus illiberal dichotomy, because, and here I'm ending, I don't think discussion should fall in the Orbanian trap of coining a democracy illiberal. It is not illiberal, it is boundedly liberal. And a last remark, we may be facing the need for a kind of boundedly liberal democracy on a global scale in view of present climate problems. The policies that need to be implemented, if I read scientific reports correctly, will have to be global, will have to be, cannot wholly be democratic, I fear, and will have to deal with matters in a rather brief span of time. Thank you.
So what you want to say is that in any case, we would need more authoritarian methods to face up to the challenges of our present. I don't know, it's possible, but I still cling to this ideal, to this liberal democratic ideal. You might be right that the terms we can change. It could be helpful to change the terms, but from the point of view, at least, of human emancipation, it's useful to distinguish. I think, at least for me, to distinguish those two kinds of emancipation. Emancipation of individual who is allowed to do what he or she wants, and this would be this liberal individualist side, and the emancipation of collectivities, right? Including collectivities which want to redistribute social welfare, and collectivities which cultivate social solidarity, not only civic or human rights solidarity, that I would sympathize or empathize with your human rights, but that we have social solidarity in the sense that I agree that we should redistribute resources, that I should do part of my resources, because I'm endowed with a lot of resources, for the public good. I still think this maybe ecological, maybe you are right, that, for instance, ecological challenge makes democracy impracticable, because if we, in some point, we will be in the situation that something should be done, and then some elite will try to take power and to save humanity on its own, but I am really fearful of that situation, because I already experienced an elite which, in the name of proletariat and in the name of the public good, and in the name of science also. Remember that we were taught in the school that Marx discovered the laws of history and so on and so forth. So I'm fearful. You might be right that it's a realistic prospect, but I'm quite fearful of that.
The next question was the person to your left. Yeah.
All right. Basically, my question has already been answered too, I think, but you've made many points. I'm just wondering to what degree you think that what you have laid out, is specific of what we call Central Europe. Thank you.
Yeah, it's not. It's not. Actually, I remember in 2015-16, we used to had this doubts to what extent you know, this is our illness, our regional illness. And of course that was the first liberal camp I mentioned. The people were saying this. All those people who see in Zeman relic of communism or agent of Putin, they would all say, well, this is our problem. We have somehow, we haven't arrived into the promised land, okay? I very quickly, Brexit and Trump victory, and then Salvini, of course, in Italy, showed that this is not the regional illness. The general causes of the illness have nothing to do with communism. And they have rather to do with the last 40 years of globalization, right? Communism and the experience of communism of course, shapes specific responses in the region and explains specificities. For instance, I would say that there are some historical reasons which can explain, not to justify, but explain a higher level of xenophobia in the countries which were rather, you know, which were not countries of immigration and which didn't have the nations, which didn't have colonial empire in the 19th century. You know, Czechs typically they have difficulties it's not, you know, to understand Western post-colonial point of view. You know, Western nations which critically reflected already for 40 years on their racism and so on and so forth. It's difficult for the Czechs, but also, of course, the fact that many of those achievements in the West actually were spurned by the cultural revolution in the 60s, right? This cultural revolution of the 60s, which then made this long march through the institutions with the 68ers, like, I don't know, Joschka Fischer and Daniel Cohn-Bendit, name them all. We didn't have this experience. So that, for instance, explains that actually our president is talking about Muslims in a much worse way than Marine Le Pen, for instance. Marine Le Pen would always say, would always blame fundamentalist Muslims or fundamentalist Islam. Our president directly says Islam is something like fascism, right? So those are quite important differences. I think it's quite, and Marine Le Pen is not yet the president of France. Well, this guy is the president of my country. So, but this is those are specificities. So the level of xenophobia, for instance, or the rudeness, or that Westerners are able to euphemize this. This is Marine Le Pen. Of course, everybody knows that she means the Muslims and all of the Muslims. But she's clever, so she uses euphemism. Okay, Zeman doesn't use any euphemism. So I think those are important differences which can be explained by the communist past. But I think the general causes and the general contradictions which brought those populists to power everywhere are quite beyond the communist history or the history of this region.
Thank you very much for the very interesting dialogue. I have a question pertaining to my experience as international organizer, co-organizer, also with people from Prague or Brno. And my friends told me that for their children's generation, they feel it hard to adapt to the right phase of Czech politics in a way, because they said that for us Havel is just too big to find my reception and my ongoing development. But now I ask you, aren't there two signs that show that something has happened to the more positive development? First, this incredibly big crowd of Czech citizens against Babiš corruption. Wasn't that a totally new way to gather, and what has happened in behind? And then I had something to do with the pirate movement 10 years ago. Yeah? Young nerds trying to get into politics to have faster, good laws. And now, after they're totally forgotten, in Czech Republic, 3 pirate members of European Parliament were elected. Never has the pirate movement gotten so many people to Brussels. 1 in Germany, 3 in Czech Republic. Which also shows that for 20 years they were able to stick to the name for what it's good for. So this big demonstration and these 3 pirate people, is this a phenomenon worth looking at from your inside perspective?
Yeah, that's a very good question. The pirates certainly is a positive phenomenon of the Czech politics. They are in the Czech parliament. They are quite powerful. They are the 3rd, according to the polls, they are the third party, which is not bad. The problem with them is that they really run on quite a populist platform, anti-corruption platform, but targeting Babiš already 3 years ago, right? And they are quite, and they have some problem that their program is not really fleshed out, so they are somehow beyond right and left, which in this time I don't think it's sufficient. But otherwise, I think it's a very positive phenomenon of the Czech politics. And they are bearers and legatees of this 1989 liberalism. That's a little bit, from my point of view, that's a little bit problematic because they are quite anti-statist. They have quite libertarian tendencies, right? But okay, the demonstration against Babiš, it's more complex. Partly it's really nostalgia a little bit. We will see what will happen in November. Partly nostalgia after '89, and it's true that Havel's image is quite powerful there behind this. Not all of them would have him as, but they are operating in this corner. This is true, like civil society, which is, you know, raising its voice against power. It has these connotations of '89. But the problem is that Babiš is not. There is an internal Czech problem, which I don't think we have a lot of time to go into it. But for some people, even liberal-minded people who acknowledge the danger of Babiš, they have been saying until quite recently that he is the lesser evil. He is the lesser evil. We have parliamentary system, but president is a populist, dangerous guy. Who is looking for a crisis in government to reshuffle the government and to replace social democracy, which is in alliance with Babiš, with much worse party, which is openly xenophobic, SPD. Okay, so it's difficult, politically speaking, to judge if the change they are striving for, namely resignation of demise of Babiš, would really, or of this government. Actually, they are appealing to the Social Democrat that Social Democrats should leave their government because it's clear that Babiš will not really, listen to them. But Social Democrats, of course, are in 2 minds. Because they know that they are doing quite so. And anyway, so it's difficult. It's a difficult situation. Because,
Pavel, can we have one more question?
Yeah.
So here in the front row, please.
Thanks very much. I wanted to ask, you were talking about the legacy of sort of Habsburg lands, the Habsburg Empire. And I was just wondering if you saw the fact that we were talking about Salvini in northern Italy, La Lega developed in northern Italy. In this country, of course, there is also a sort of populism, a xenophobic populism. And I'm just wondering if you see any sort of commonality amongst these countries which are all at one stage part of the Habsburg lands, including northern Italy, of course. If that's part of the legacy, or is that just a coincidence?
No, I think the commonalities are not really explainable from the history of this region. This is clear, or from the history of of communism, from communist history. I think the commonalities are explainable from the last 40 years of globalization and social inequalities, but also a kind of disrespect those people who are the losers of globalization feel. The last book by Fukuyama is actually very good, describing Fukuyama's identities, the title of the book, and is talking about that it's not only inequality, but it's also disrespect. That the people who are, and you see it in France, it's quite clear, the Gilets jaunes movement, that people, it's not only about that they are left out somehow at the bottom, or that they don't have resources to cope with the situation. It's also the disrespect of the French elite towards them. So I think that the commonalities are linked with the globalization and with this disrespect, which allows those demagogues use the resentment and grievances of those losers of globalization for their political projects.
Pavel, I want to finish up with the last point, and I'm asking you for maybe a short answer to it. We have dedicated our discussion very much to the legacy of '89, and it has become very clear that you are critical of it in some regards. That you criticize certain tendencies for elitism within liberalism that you find dangerous. Since this is the 30th anniversary of the '89 revolution, and since this is also part of what is very important to you, I would at the very end, so to speak, ask you to maybe say a few words about what you think, why this revolution of '89 is still an important thing for us today, and what is, so to speak, the positive leftovers that we can still link up to. You can do this very shortly. I don't want to force you to give what we in German call a Sonntagsrede, so it doesn't have to be a big appraisal, but I know that you regard the heritage of '89 quite ambivalent, and maybe also at the end to stress the other aspect. I
think already I hinted at it. I think that civic solidarity and civil society in the Havelian sense of the word is a very important thing, and the drawback was that we forgot about social solidarity. We forgot about the need for the state, especially for the people who are not endowed with resources. But the positive side, and I still feel as an inheritor of that legacy, I think, because I still, still remember the excitement of the Velvet Revolution, where suddenly people were liberated from their fears. I think that was the most important thing, and felt that suddenly we are all together, united in this idea of free society. Right? I think it's a very important value for me, and I want to keep that value, but I want to complement it with much more social approach. But free society is still my utopia.
So thank you, Pavel. That was our attempt to understand, as it says in the title, to understand the illiberal turn in Central Europe. Maybe we have come a bit closer. This was also, as I said before, the very last evening in the Wien Museum. So thanks to all of you for being with us on this last evening in the old Wien Museum. And I'm not one of the main organizers of the event, but I think hopefully the Humanities Festival at some point will return to the new Wien Museum. So thanks to all of you, and thanks most of all to Pavel Barša. Thank you.